Well, just before we get started, folks, let me go ahead and just deal with a couple of logistics here. If anybody is having any technical support, needing any technical support, two ways to get a hold of us. One is that you can contact us at webinars@davidco.com, or you can give us a call at 805-646-8432. The next part I wanted just to cover is for those of you who have access to our questions box, this is really a Q&A today for all of you Connect members. Really, this is a fabulous opportunity to particularly access David in all the ways that he customizes GTD and his experience. And so please feel free to participate. And if we are not able to get to your question or answer your question, we'll give you information at the end of where you can go to get it answered. So just to make sure that that question box is working, and also David and I would love to know where all of you are joining us, where you're coming from today. I happen to be outside of the Portland, Maine area. David, where are you today?
I am in Santa Barbara, California.
You are?
Yes, I am.
Fabulous. So look, we've got somebody in Amherst, Mass, in Houston, Texas, California, Sweden. Fabulous. Welcome. Boston area, Canada, Denver. I love it. Don't you love it, David? This is exactly what we wanted to create, is this incredible international GTD community.
London, Copenhagen, Winnipeg. Cool.
Germany. Fabulous.
Lausanne.
Oh, that's really great.
How gorgeous.
Ah,
yeah.
Breckenridge, Colorado, although the ski season's ended. So David, talk to us a little bit about customizing your GTD system. You know, one of the things that I always get as a coach is there such an art form to be able to customize and yet still stay within best practices. One of the things I absolutely love about this methodology is it's not rule-based. This is the way you have to do it. This is the high road, or you're out of here. But basically, really best practices.
Well, you know, you're going to hear me all during this hour keep coming back to some of the core principle of GTD. And the core principle, and you know, it's the big secret that I've let out of the bag, which is getting things done is not about getting things done. It's really about being appropriately engaged. So, for instance, everybody here who's on the webinar are probably not doing a lot of other things. Now, some of you are probably multitasking while you're listening to me and Meg, but there's still a gazillion things that you are not doing right now. The degree to which you are free to be just doing your multitasking or listening or watching us is the degree to which you are appropriately engaged with everything else. So it comes back to the old saw, you know, you can only feel good about what you're not doing when you know what you're not doing. So those become the ultimate drivers of the systems. You know, people still are always asking me, and as I'm sure they are you, Meg, look, what do I do with this? Where do I put this? What kind of, you know, where would I put this kind of list? Or what should this list be? And I have that sort of wonderfully dumb universal answer called, well, what do you think you need to do with it to get it off your mind? Because that's the ultimate criterion about your system. Now, that's why customizing this system, and everybody's system is going to be unique, because for some people to get it off their mind, they need to have it, you know, in a box right in front of them, you know, so that they can see all of that and they can see it constantly and they see what's in the box. Some people will get it off their mind by putting it in some file folder that they only bring out on Friday afternoons because they pay bills on Friday afternoons. And some people get it off their mind by saying, hey, you know, hiring 3 people to follow them around and give it to them. And that gets it off their mind. And believe it or not, you know, as you know, Meg, that every one of those is absolutely fine. Now, based on our years of experience and thousands of hours that we've spent desk side and phone side and Skype side with all the people, you know, you and I've worked with, there are a lot of things we can tend to say that, well, if you do it that way, here's the risk that you're going to run into. because a system involves people's behaviors as well as it is what's the physical system that you've got. So a trusted system, even if you have all your phone calls on a calls list and you have it in a nice little list manager, if some part of you doesn't trust you're going to open that list manager when you have a phone and time, then you don't have a trusted system and your psyche will start to take it back. So there's the big, long sort of kind of non-answer to the ultimate answer about customizing your system. You haven't found anything other than that, have you, Meg?
No, I haven't, because it's interesting. I just got off of training 2 new coaches. They were actually up here in Maine for a couple of weeks, and it was really fascinating having some new folks here, and the tendency to kind of want to jump in or maybe give examples or this is where you could put it versus really asking those key questions. Well, what do you need to do to get it off of your mind? I mean, people think that when we're coaching that they think that we're like really bored. But I learned so much from the clients too by asking those key questions. Well, what meaning does it have to you? What meaning it may have to me, I may keep it, but it may not have meaning to you and you don't keep it. Or, really to say, well, what do you have to get it off of your mind? Sometimes it's a lot to get it off of their mind, and sometimes it's not really anything. And they're like, you know what, I don't need to do anything with it, and then they just chuck it. So asking those key questions to yourself, I think then really organically allows you to be creative about where you want to park those results in your trusted system.
Sure. And by the way,
people jump.
Yeah. And it gets subtle, of course, what's on your mind. In other words,
right.
Is your strategic plan or your vision of success for career and life on your mind? Oh yeah, well I guess it kind of is. So a lot of the things that are pulling on our psyche, you have to as you're going down the path of mastery to GTD, sort of really embodied in there. It's really about being able to constantly refine, starting to notice what's pulling on you, pushing on you, where do you have attention. And before I forget, just a big parenthesis on this, I'm happy to be answering questions, but it's also really great, given the folks I can see that are online with us. A lot of you guys have come up with some great ideas yourself. As Meg said, it's fun for us to watch what people do and how creative they are and the different ways that they come up with managing the inventory of their commitments and being able to then review them and engage with them appropriately. So very happy to open to you folks when people ask some questions, or if you've got some creative ideas you think that you'd love to share with the group. Very, very, very open to hear that. That'd be fabulous.
So Connect members, one of the things David and I thought about today was we're going to divide this webinar into 4 parts. We're going to talk first about tools, and then we're going to talk about projects, and then context, and then the weekly review, and ways to be able to look at the customization of it. Where have you customized it to the point that really works for you? I've also seen customization that actually made it more complicated, so we can kind of riff on that subject as well. So David, let's start with tools. One of the things that I have noticed in my 14 years with you is I actually had a call yesterday with somebody who just got stopped dead in their tracks because of the tools. We try so desperately not to make it about the tool, but at the same time it kind of can be, because you need to have that trusted list manager. And if it really repels you, then you're going to resist it, and you're going to keep emails in your inbox, and you're going to keep stuff on your mind, and you're going to have little scraps of pieces of paper or Post-its and get kind of scattered. So what is your sense lately about tools?
Well,
and if you want to start just kind of an overview, and then we can talk about each one of these sections, starting with collection.
Sure. Well, let me start with sort of a David Allenism. One of my little Zen paradoxes. You ready? Is that the more you really embody GTD, the less the tools matter. And the other truth is, the more you really embody GTD, the more tools are absolutely critical. So we can make anything work, but if you can, I mean, come on, all the tools could die away. Just give me a pen and a piece of paper, and that's all I need. I mean, there is a real truth to that. At the same time, I'm always looking for what's the coolest tool, what's the coolest piece of gear, because there's a lot of motivation in cool tools. I remember in the old days, when the Palm came out, the stylus, and I learned to do graffiti on the palm. I did so much good thinking and so much good work just because I love to see the backlight on the palm in a dark bar or restaurant. So, so the tools, cool gear is one of the high motivators. And we all know we all need motivation because we're all going to resist parts of GTD practices like the plague, and big secret, me too. So, so tools don't matter, and tools matter a ton. So it's interesting. So if anybody wants to kind of unpack that, that koan, that would be that'd be fun. So yes, there's a wide range, and certainly over time, as the technology has increased, in the early days when I was first, developing this model and experimenting with it and playing with it, there weren't even any mid-tech kind of planners out there. Golly, in 1981, when I started doing some of this stuff around the aerospace world, if you even had a pocket daytimer, you were considered something of a productivity geek. So, so at that point, there was no, you didn't have all those options. And then, of course, in the mid 80s, when the planners started to show up, then that started to add a lot more, cool factor to, sort of personal management and tools themselves. So, some of the original really cool stuff was showing up from Denmark, and, I became a distributor for time design out of the Time System company out of Copenhagen, because they just had such an elegant tool for that. It was a great self-management tool, and that's where sort of loose leaf notebooks or portable sort of self-management tools really started to, become fairly ubiquitous, at least in the professional world out there. So you weren't considered too much of a freak or a geek if you had a black notebook with tabs in it and you were keeping track of stuff. So that then added more complexity, and then of course the digital world showed up. Palm was sort of a groundbreaking tool to begin with in terms of a list manager, and probably still as good a list manager as there is out there. Too bad it kind of went the way it did, because it was so simple, so easy to use. It was so handy the form factor was great. And easy to input, and the desktop version of it was really cool. But then, of course, this started to proliferate. Let me try that again. Proliferate like crazy. And then, of course, with the success of GTD, the book, and especially when it hit the nerve in the high-tech crowd, I think at last count there were over 400 software apps out there right now that are purporting to support the GTD process. So that's where you start to really get into a lot of potential frustration, complexity, and also coolness. Kind of depends on whether you're a technophobe or a technophile, or whether you found the one that sort of fits with you. And then, of course, you have all the Android versus iOS systems, and you have just huge amounts of complexity that have shown up out there. So given all of that, yeah, you have the stress of opportunity now relative to tools. So maybe if we sort of, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, Grant, I think, wrote something that I think is really fabulous, and he said, I wasted 5 to 7 years looking for the perfect tool, and I forgot to get things into any trusted system. Now any tool works, just some better than others. And I really try, when somebody really gets wrapped around the tool, to really unhook them, just that just what you were saying, David, and I think this is just a really good reminder to not make it about the tool, and at the same time it is about the tool, and that is the paradox, and just to kind of own it and work at it. The other thing is that a lot of people I find try to find just one tool. They think that everything can be in one place. And I said, look, you got to have as many places as you need, but not too many. So can you kind of walk us through a little bit about how you have made some decisions about, what you wanted in the list manager, and how you deal with incubate, and how you deal with reference and decision support? Can you kind of give us a flavor of, because every time you share, I'm just like, oh, David, I didn't know that, and that's really kind of cool to know.
Yeah, well, I'll even start up at the top with collection, because collection is such a prime factor there. And as I'm sure most of you know, the note taker wallet is my key collector as well as my in basket sitting right here. I use those both tremendously. If I go anywhere, by the way, these days I don't even really need to have my list manager with me a lot of times, because my laptop is usually close enough by that I can get back to it when I'm doing work and need to be reminded of work to do. But boy, my capture mechanism is always with me. So note taker wallets, and again, there's the infinite range of those things. 3x5 cards in your pocket, notepads, any of that stuff. So obviously, that should be somewhat self-evident. In terms of when the digital world showed up, then you had all the collection opportunities of, now I can text myself. If I'm on my iPad, which has a different access, I have a Gmail account there. So for my iPad, I can actually shoot myself an email into my Lotus Notes email account, which is my primary email account. So I can just type a note there and just send it. So now I can capture things if I happen to have an iPad with me, or I can Siri capture it on my iPhone and then just email it to myself if I want to. A lot of those tools actually are cool. If a lot of the tools, especially the tech tools, work really, really well on a rainy Saturday when your inner geek shows up. and you have time to dork around with all that stuff. Of course, when the reality of Monday splats you in the face, a lot of those things just go away because you have to do too much thinking to use them. So you have to make sure that if you're customizing your tools, that it's fine. I've experimented and explored with tons of them. I've thrown away 10 times as many tools as I wind up using, just because it's kind of the business I'm in. I'm always looking for what's the easiest way to lower the barrier to entry to get stuff out of my head and get it into the system. And unfortunately, people often, back to your point of wasting time trying to find the right tool. A lot of people, try to create the perfect tool, and then it takes too much thought, too much energy to actually get the stuff into the tool. So that's why pen and paper just can't be beat. I can't imagine ever getting rid of that. Voice commands and being able to do that will be easier and easier. But even a voice command, I'm going to have to listen back to it again and probably type it again. So it just becomes a lot easier to also rethink it when I see a scribble. And that's just me, but just scribbling notes and throwing them in my own in-basket, nothing beats that. That's still my primary mode of collecting.
Exactly. One Connect member asked, my problem, I embody the collection habit to the max on paper-based materials and enjoy it, but then processing paper becomes a drag. My entire system is digital. How can you deal with this contradiction?
Yeah. You're going to have that. That's why I say the barrier to entry. You need to be able to decide, look, is it easier for me to just go ahead and capture it digitally? And that's absolutely fine. I capture a lot of stuff while at my computer. Sure, I can just, I can turn over and type a note or throw it in some sort of a collection bucket. It's a real good idea to have some very specific place. The problem with the computer is out of sight, out of mind. And also, nobody really still has an elegant capture tool. We designed one back in 1995 when we started Actioneer. It was a little post-it just throw on your screen, and you could type in there from anywhere. And there are some tools out there that, as long as you get used to them, and you really have sort of constant access to a keyboard, and you can get it into that system, that's fine. But you're still not going to beat paper. Now, one thing you can do with paper these days, I've just got a multi-page scanner, and you could start to scan that, and if you have the right kind of software, even in versions of Evernote and other places like that, that you can actually then do character recognition. But again, it sounds great. It sounds like it should be easy to do, and I've yet to see it be that easy. And so, you're still just going to have to find the fastest way to do it. I think the main key is just processing all your paper notes. I mean, most of my paper notes get thrown away within 24 to 48 hours. That's the point. They truly are just placeholders for me to then get it back into the system. But I think a mistake people make is assuming, even you Connect members, I've gotten the sense many times that people still don't make the distinction between collecting and organizing. And so I want to be able to collect it and organize it immediately right into my digital world. But the truth is, a whole lot of stuff needs to be rethought or thought at a more discrete level before you decide what you're going to do with it. So it's actually a good idea to kind of have a stopgap place to stop and say, okay, wait a minute, now what exactly do I need to do with that or about that? I've seen too many people lose meeting notes because they're taking meeting notes on their computer and then it goes away, as opposed to taking handwritten notes, throw those in your in-basket, and then that forces you sooner than later, because it's in your face. Okay, to get clean now, I really need to decide what are the actions, what are the projects, what do I need to do based upon that meeting and that interaction, because I want to get that meeting off my mind as soon as I can. And if you've got digital notes in there. Again, none of this is, as we said to begin with, oh, well, whatever gets that off your mind. But you're going to have these two different media no matter what. You're also going to have audio media, as well. So I don't think you can get rid of that. You could get better, more. I think you can explore out there. Certainly in the U.S. and I'm not sure about other countries whether they have the same kinds of services available now. But I use TalkScribe. It's where I can just call an 800 number, toll free, and up to 2 minutes I can just talk, and that's actually a long time to just take a note, and it's transcribed and then sent back to me in my email. So that's a fast way to get from just things off my mind. It's the easiest way to do it in the car, for sure, if you have a car phone that's set up hands-free. Anyway, those are all the we could spend an hour just on all the different sort of collection stuff, but I think those are that gives everybody the sense that that just needs to be something that's easy, fun, accessible, and really ubiquitous. You need to have one with you all the time that you can just get used to. So moving on to list managers, well, there's where you have an infinite number of things. We've mentioned it before. You've got kind of low-tech and mid-tech and high-tech ways to do that. Low-tech being like a box or a file folder that actually holds different particles that represent different things to be reminded of. So a list manager is really a way to describe, okay, how do I create a physical, visual, psychological category with clean edges around it? In the early days when I first started doing this work, we would just create folders. Again, this was before we had planners. We would just create folders with different pieces of paper that represented different things to be reminded of. So when you got something out of your head, you just write it on a letter-sized piece of paper, drop it in your in-basket. When you're then processing it, you pick it up, decide what the next action is, write the next action on it, or stick a Post-it on it with the action on it, and then throw that into a folder. And the folders could then be organized by either context, like here's all the calls, or paper, or pieces of paper in this folder, etc. So, low-tech actually works very well as a way to categorize certain kinds of things. Obviously, read and review. If you've got magazines or books or printed PDF, articles or things that you just want to read, in casual reading when you have a chance, or when you're on a plane, when you can't boot up your digital stuff. That's great to have in a plastic folder. As you know, that's one of our system folders, and it's also great to have an in basket or an in tray or a box that represents, okay, all this stuff is stuff to read. So that, in a sense, is a list manager. It's just on the low-tech form, and that's just the most easiest way to be able to do that. You can even set up a shelf, that says here's all the stuff that I want to read, or here's my library. It's kind of like my someday maybe list of books that I'm going to read, as opposed to just keep for reference in in some sort of a library. Then of course when you move into the mid-tech game, that's where loose leaf notebooks, and a lot, as you know, Meg, a lot of high-tech people are getting attracted back to loose leaf notebooks and paper-based lists, simply because it makes you more conscious about them. It's more in your face, and it's a little easier to then be able to see the relationship of those different lists to each other. So that is the good news about having a lower tech than the digital world, because in the digital world, it's very hard to see a whole context of things. It's getting better at it, as you get bigger screens and you're able to, if you're using multiple screens, it is a little bit easier to step back and see the larger gestalt of your stuff. But again, it's tricky business, because out of sight, out of mind. So the digital world, we don't tend to recommend to people unless you really are, you love it, and that's going to be your motivator to then start to manage lists. And also you have the discipline or the habit of really going in and looking at the list that you need to look at when you didn't look at them. So again, that's why, as you know, there are people that you and I both know that are high-tech people that have gone back to some version of either printed out versions of their lists so they can see them all together in that way, or just actually working just a paper-based list itself. What have you seen lately, Meg? Have you seen the trend, that trending either way?
I was going to ask you, because I in the last year have set more people up with paper-based planners than I have in a decade.
Really?
I don't know if it's just the folks that are showing up. I don't know. I don't know if it's just they're really giving themselves permission to just go back to what had worked for them. I think a lot of them had gone digital, and they found that it was a real barrier for them. You know, I want to call Fred, click, 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 call Fred, right? Paper-based planner, just go to the tab and put in call Fred. You know, one of the things that I do when I'm working with clients is really assess all those clicks, because for a lot of people, if you have to do a lot of click, 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 and it's not habitual and it's not intuitive and it's not automatized, it's a barrier.
Yeah.
And they don't want to go through all the click, 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 click to call Fred. And for some people, that's fine. And I know you're always looking for as few clicks as possible to get into capturing what you need to, or when you process and organize into that system to call Fred.
Sure. By the way,
I find that really kind of fascinating, that a lot of people are like, forget it, and then they go to something like a paper-based planner.
Yeah, I see Brian Good just made a note that he's a software engineer and he's been using just a paper planner since 2004. It's funny, when I thank Brian, I did a seminar for Second Life. You know, these are the guys that built the whole virtual world out there, you know, in the early days when it was really hot and very, a great new thing and very interesting. And I did a seminar. They had a bunch of GTD champions that were inside the company, and the head of all of their servers. I mean, this guy was like techie out the wazoo. And I asked him how he managed that whole high-tech, huge server bank and chain of networks and all of this stuff. And he just pulled out a stack of 3x5 cards. He said, computer can't do it. So, that was one of the sort of more dramatic examples of the fact that sometimes, we need more of that physical, visual, touchy, context-rich thing that paper actually gives you, and the computer doesn't yet. But again, no right or wrong about that. And as you know, there's a ton of folks out there using great list managers. And again, a lot of that certainly depends on whether you're in the PC or the Mac world. In the Mac world, a lot of them became quite popular, like OmniFocus or Things and Toodle-Do has become popular. And again, they're really all just list managers with various kinds of bells and whistles on them. Anything that can make a list, anything that you can categorize it easily, anything you can get into it and out of it without too much hassle or work or having to think too hard, can work. They're showing up. I get an email at least one a week for new software apps that people are asking for me to look at them or endorse them or whatever in terms of it. So,
what are the main qualities, David, that you feel that GTD Connect members should be looking for their list manager? Any kind of tips or tricks on that?
Well, whatever they're currently using to make a list is, you don't want to go too far afield from that. So if you're not used to digital, just make that. It's okay to start to move to digital if you wanted to explore that and make that a project, but just realize that's going to be a project in addition to doing GTD, is learning the tool and getting used to it. So that's that's where people really need to start, is what they're already comfortable with. Because if you're just learning GTD or trying to increase or improve your practice of it, you're adding, more stuff that's potentially distracting if you're trying to then move into a system or a systematic approach that you're not comfortable with or familiar with yet.
Yep.
But other than that, it kind of depends on which environment you're in. Best thing to do is surf the forums, see who's using them, see what people say about them, and just trust your intuition, trust your gut. Yeah, go ahead.
No, can you go ahead and just riff a little bit on the incubate, reference, and decision support, and then we'll move on to the next section on project?
Sure. Incubate, there's a lot of different versions I've seen people do in terms of things I might want to do, but not now. And there's, we've talked about sort of 26 or 50 shades of gray here in terms of is your restaurant list an incubate, or is that reference, or is it an active list? My next time in New York, is that incubate? So creating lists that are not as soon as I can, let me go take this action, but in certain contexts, I want to be able to review options on that list. And so you don't have to call it a someday maybe list, and it may just actually fall into the category of, when I'm in this situation, I want to look at all of these as options. And so, I've now got 3 kinds of at computer list. I have my at computer that does not require me to have a web connection. And then I have my at computer when I'm wired, and then I have my surf in my web surf list. My web surf list has probably got 150 things on it right now. And the way I deal with that is that's the kind of stuff that, hey, David, you should go see this cool YouTube. Hey, go watch the cat play the piano or whatever all that stuff is. It might be fun. When my brain's toast, I might then just pull out that list and pick some stuff off of that. But it's very much like read and review. The way you process that is when it falls over, you throw it away. And that, in a way, is like incubate. So I think you need to give yourself permission. Over the years, customizing that, coming up with lots of different ways and cool things to hold in some level of abeyance, is really great. As you know, I'm kind of a foodie, and I love to keep track of restaurants. So I have a whole category of that are based on different locales. When I go to that locale, I'm now using Evernote to create different notes. For instance, New York City, I'll be going there tomorrow. So I have a note that has all my restaurant list on it. Then I have another note for all the cultural things and all the museums I might want to go see. I have another note that has all the people I might actually want to connect with when I'm there. So
David, the question though is how do you? Because I'm always so curious about, is there a thinking or a thought process that you do when you say, look, these are the things I want to park in Evernote. These are the things that I want to park in the brain. These are the things that I want to park in Lotus Notes. I mean, is there anything for the Connect members to kind of help them think? Because that's one of the things I'm actually getting in a lot with clients is there's so many places now for them to park their reference. I just didn't know if there are any best practices or no.
No, there are not. I have no system whatsoever other than what I feel like doing. It is a constant R&D for me, constant. And as the things are changing, as I hopped in over a year ago into the iOS world, into the Apple world, just because, I'd been so PC-based for so many years, and I knew that was going to be a bear that I needed to wrestle to the ground just to see what it was and to see what the difference really was. And, the cool thing about that is all the integrated things that you can do. So in Evernote, when I change a note on my iPhone, it's now changed back on my desktop as well. So the ability to be able to have sort of transparency across my systems and tools, that's stuff that's cloud-based, is pretty slick.
Right. Well, let me just say this, because one of the things I'm always saying to clients is, look, how do you want to retrieve this information? And that for me really answers a lot of, well, I want to retrieve this when I have my iPhone, or I want to retrieve this when I'm at my computer. That also really helps me decide where I'm going to park what. Hey, David, we got 3 more sections to do, so is there anything that you want to wrap up on this section, and we'll move on to the next one?
Well, the decision support thing, that's a whole big area that people have often started to customize a lot of things. What are all the checklists that you might find useful? As well as, how do I then manage all the project plans and project support materials that I might need to keep track of? And that's as different as there are people out there, in terms of paper-based support, mind maps, either hand-drawn or on the computer, and as well as checklists. And again, any of those kinds of things, if you have a good list manager, there's an awful lot of checklists that's a great way that people start to and can explore customizing. What are all the things that you do consistently that you need to keep track of? I'd also put in that category instructions. What are my instructions? What are the 7 things I need to do when I launch this, that, or the other? Or what are the 14 things that we need to go through? So, fabulous book out there if you haven't read Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto, that just reminds us all of, wow, there's so many things your brain does not need to try to remember if you can build in a systematic way to do it. So a lot of that just is the content, and the content will start to tell you probably where's the best place to put that, and what's the best tool to put it in. So that's, we could spend a whole hour and a half just on all the different vagaries of decision support and what that looks like out there. But that's a lot of where the world is going, I think, and the computer world is helping us decide. It won't make decisions for us, but it can provide us back. What do I need to see right now to think through this kind of project or this kind of situation? Or, hey, for the summer, what are the things I want to see as options for me to be able to do? So that's more just an invitation for everybody to be creative and say, that'd be kind of cool to make that list, or make that as a picture, or make that a checklist in some form. So then I'll shut up, and we can move. Yeah.
We can always come back and read. It's just so rich, though. But this is the thing that I'm seeing more and more and more in my coaching, is just what we're talking about here in terms of tools. So I know that I really appreciate really spending the majority of this webinar on this, because I think GTD Connect members are really wanting to hear from you, David, what your feelings about all of this is. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm as much as just interested in seeing how people are doing all the various different kinds of things that they do, because there are so many possibilities now. In the early days, that's why we actually included a planner, the time design planner, with our seminars, because most people didn't have any tool at all. And so we just found what we thought was the best one, because people really needed something. Now they've got the opposite problem. They have so many options and so many tools. You know,
oh, those good old days.
That causes us to do webinars like this, where we bring people back to, it doesn't matter, and how are you doing it? Oh, well, that's cool. I never saw that before. Okay.
So look. So now the next topic here is projects. You know, and one of the things that you know, there are different options here, and I think one of the things that I'd like to be able to share is for people to really see the different options they can have for tracking their projects. Not necessarily we're talking about project support material, but really where they're going to track their projects. So any thoughts about this, David?
Yeah, it's a big one actually, and it's one we always get questions. Should I divide my project list into personal or professional? Should I divide my project list into X, Y, and Z? And there's no right or wrong about that. You know, the key thing, and that's, if you look at the bottom of that slide, you see that question mark called, what's the purpose of the list? See, I don't split personal or professional, because the purpose of my project list is simply to, at least every 7 days, have some list of all the stakes in the ground I've got up there to make sure no dust is settling inappropriately on any of my commitments across my whole life and work. Because that's the purpose of my list, I don't need to look at 2 lists. I just need to look at 1. If, however, you have, you know, we've run across people that do not want to put, they need to keep their personal data in a separate place even, or kept separately than their professional, because they're keeping it in their work application, and they have, you know, they risk the liability of having all of that yanked from them, you know, because the company owns that data. So if the purpose of your list is to make sure you've got a discrete line between what you consider personal and professional, so that the personal doesn't bleed over for any other reasons of potential vulnerability, then you need to have those on 2 lists. So it really comes back to what's the purpose for it. For instance, you'll see on their areas of focus, you know, Meg, a lot of times people really like to see their projects. Here's all of my finance projects. Here's all of my marketing projects. Here's all of my staff development projects. Or in their personal life, here's all my family projects. Here's all my health projects. Or maybe here's all my personal projects, and then the 4 or 5 major areas in their work. Oftentimes we see it that way. If the purpose is for a sense, I need a sense of balance, or I want to be able to see across it that way, or there's some reason I want to be able to see those discretely. I coached an executive, a CEO, a few years ago, he had like 130 projects. This guy was a real big overcreator, but he was building a senior team, and so we actually divided all of his projects into the different hats he was wearing. These are your finance projects, here's your marketing projects, here's your operations projects, here's your admin projects, for the very specific purpose, because he wanted to see which vice presidents should he hire first. Should he get a marketing VP, or did he need a CFO first? And only when he could start to see how many things he had on his plate that he'd then be able to offload, then it made it a lot clearer to him what his team building, schedule was going to look like. And so that was because he had that reason. A lot of salespeople like to keep their sales projects on a separate list than all the rest of their projects, because their sales manager may, yank their chain at any point in time and ask them status about all that stuff. In the same vein, some people, like an EVP I coached at one time, like to keep a separate list of all the projects the CEO had given him, because whenever he had those ad hoc meetings, he always liked to have that in front of him just to stay sharp of what the deliverables are that his CEO expected of him, and he wanted to just keep that discreet. So I could go on and on about how many different ways I've seen people do that, but it's not about any right or wrong. It's about is there a purpose for doing it? I would tend to say keep it as simple as you can, and only start to split it out or do it otherwise if that actually makes it simpler for you. Another example on there would be, if you have a huge, huge project that's part of your job. I've coached somebody who was, a lot of what they did was manage, the big, big quarterly conferences that they held, and so it made sense to them to have the summer conference project list. So sometimes that's tricky because you've got dependent and independent parts of that project, but there were enough independent projects on there that it made sense to have just a separate page that has, here's all my summer conference projects on there. I got to get speakers, I've got to get the venue, I've got the whatever, and it just made it easier for her to actually see it that way. So no right or wrong about all that. Projects delegated, I know that's another one too that a lot of executives like to see. Well, here's a project that I'm interested in that it get done. So it's kind of a high-level waiting for list, but they've really handed off all the operational management of those projects to one of their key lieutenants. But they like to keep that list. So here's all my projects I've delegated out with the person's name that they delegated it to, because they kind of like to see that along with and side by side with their own project list, as opposed to moving it over on a waiting for list.
So a couple of things to add to that. For those folks that really do delegate out projects to people, I was working with a president who didn't make that distinction. And he had something like 125 projects. And when we really separated out his projects that he owned with his job as CEO president that had next actions versus the projects that he was monitoring from other people and put that on that delegated project list, his list went from 125 something like down to like 30, and he was like a new man.
Yeah.
He was so happy and relieved. And they're also focusing lists, and he couldn't focus because he was mixing. And so for some people they can mix, but for a lot of people they can't. So for example, Allison was asking me how I set up my projects list. I've done it both ways. I've actually mixed both personal and professional, but then sometimes I really pull it out because sometimes I think that I get out of alignment, and sometimes it's really nice for me just to see these are all my professional projects and these are all my personal projects. So only recently have I actually pulled out my personal and professional because, like you said, that's the purpose. It allows me to focus more, but I still have a complete inventory of my life. We talk about, work is work, personally and professionally. And I actually start my areas of focus my projects with an area of focus, like you were saying, David, because that just, for some reason, I always have done that. By having just a flat project list, for some reason, having those areas of focus keep me more in alignment of the higher horizons of focus.
Yeah.
So I always say to people, look, it's a really wonderful exercise to see where you're in and out of alignment. David doesn't necessarily do that, but you kind of have to play around with it. And what I want GTD Connect members to be able to do is play around with all of this and see what works for you. At the end of the day, though, you want a complete inventory of all the things that you have committed that are going to take more than one action, and you want to have enough project lists, but you don't want to have too many.
Well, the GTD system is really about getting all the right maps, M-A-P-S, the maps that you need to stay appropriately oriented. That's all it is. So the GTD system is really like having a map room. Okay, how do I want to orient myself? So what you just said, Meg, is, hey, look, I'm losing my orientation by compressing them together. They're imploding. I get more appropriate orientation by being able to see it this way. So that should be the driving question for everybody about what map do you need to see that will orient you most appropriately. So, your calendar is a map for where do I need to be this afternoon. I need a map about when I'm going to talk to my boss. Here are all the things that I want to be aware of that orient me in that conversation. I want a map for this week, which is the weekly review is going to give you kind of looking out in terms of, this week and the coming weeks to see that kind of a map. So that's where a lot of customizing is going to happen out even beyond just your project list, is to think about, do you have all the right maps? Do you feel appropriately oriented? And then that should then give you the keys about, okay, which ones might I need to create or tweak to make that more orienting for me.
Yeah, Charlie asked a good question about what is the time frame that distinguishes a project from a someday maybe? 1 week, 1 month?
Someday maybe is never, and projects are work on them now. if I can. So that's my distinction. So, someday maybe would be how often do you want to review whether or not you want to pull the trigger and activate any of these. So I think the real key is to ask yourself, how often should I review those? But if it's, hey, I'm only going to start on that project at a certain point, that's what you want to use a tickler file or a time-based trigger to say, hey, come March 1st, that's when I want to say, set up the summer for the kids. Camp and extracurricular activities and classes we want to take, etc. So if you don't even want to think about that or do anything about it until March 1st, but that's a good time to then insert those, I would just have those triggers. I wouldn't call that someday maybe. I would call that those are projects that will then come to fore or come into play only after a certain date. So those are sort of time-based triggers for those kinds of things. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah,
but I
another thing that I just make the distinction is a project is something that I have the bandwidth and resources to do the next action on. Because if I don't have the bandwidth or resource, I can have a project in the next action but not do the thinking. Yeah, but do I have the resources and bandwidth to do the next action? And sometimes I've been over ambitious and over creative, and I really need to do some incubation.
Sure.
So fabulous. But this gives people some really wonderful tips and tricks to think really about how they're working their project list and what's working or not working. David, can I go ahead and move on to the next one?
Why not?
Contexts.
Yeah,
David, let's have this come about. We've got about 5 minutes on this topic, and then we've got about 5 minutes on the weekly review.
Well, this comes about because a lot of people they read getting things done, or they see a lot of, hey, you're dividing actions by location or context or whatever, and that all looks too complex for me. And as you know, we've had to backpedal and say, look, just make it simple if you only want to. If you only want to have an at-office and at-home list and errands list, fine. Start there. The trick is, the reason context showed up was simply because if you're really keeping a total inventory of totally all the actions you have, and you put all those on one list, you blow a fuse. Then you you get out there, you want to make calls, you have to then hunt through 120 things to find the 6 phone calls on there. So it just made a lot more sense to start to sort those by what can I possibly do now. So, and context can range all over the place. Context can be a psychological context. These are all the things to do when my brain is toast. Like, as you know, our friend Robert Peake had at brain dead context. So when he had no horsepower in his head, there was a huge list of things that were just sort of screw turning things that didn't take a lot of horsepower. So that made a lot of sense. At times I've created a context of my actions that were that required a deep sort of creative thought for myself. Even if they were at computer, I needed a different kind of context there because I had so many of them, and it was really overwhelming me on my at computer list. It all felt terrible when I looked at it. So to pull out the ones that were really, that I was really procrastinating about and avoiding because they required, deep thinking. Actually, when I put all those on one list, didn't feel nearly so bad at all. So, that made sense for me too. Again, it's going back to what are the best orientation maps for how to be reminded of your action items that you have and can do. So the sign of not enough is if you're avoiding your list. The sign of too many is if you're avoiding your list. So if you're avoiding your list, you might want to ask yourself, do I have too many? It looks and feels too complicated where I have to think too much about which list does this go on? Or do you need to go, which way might you need to take it? If you're fine, it's all on cruise control, then whatever you're doing is great. But just pay attention to that, because there may be even temporary things. Like I have a before trip context. I've been going on a big trip, like 2 or 3 weeks. A week or two before the trip, I create a before trip context, and then I drag everything off of all the other lists in multiple contexts. So I'll have phone calls and errands and things to talk to people about, all on that one list, simply because I only want to look there and get all of those done because I've just decided everything else can wait. So that's the range of things and reason that one might have different reasons to sort these things in those different ways.
Leslie says, I think, a really wonderful typical journey of a lot of folks, which is, she says, I started by what GTD provided and modified it to fit my needs. Now I review when they are no longer working for me and change them. which I think is fabulous. I mean, I know that I'm always changing it up. I mean, I remember one point, this is the funny story that years ago, I mean, like over a decade ago, I had one waiting for list, and I had all these arbitrary due dates, and I had exclamation points on them, and half of them were red, and, you know, I had like 65 of them, and it's completely unruly. And I pulled Catherine Allen out, your wife, and I just said, I've turned into a client, and I have this like totally unruly waiting for list. And Catherine looked at me very calmly and straight-faced, and she said, well, it looks like you need more than one waiting for list. And I'm like, what? What? Can you do that? You can do that? And that was like really my first aha moment of, oh, you know, I can customize this, because in my job, I had waiting for inquiries. I had waiting for clients to schedule. I had waiting for internal with the David Allen Company. And I ended up having several waiting for lists. Like I needed to break it out because the waiting fors had different meaning. It had different time frame. There were some waiting fors that I was in every day. There were some waiting fors that I only needed to look at monthly. And there were some waiting fors that I needed to look at weekly. And once I got that, then ever since then, I've really not had an issue going ahead and customizing these lists. Now, there are next actions on this list, but, you know, like you said, David, you know, at one point you had a writing list that when you were in writing mode, you didn't want to see all those other ad hoc computer things on the list, and so you pulled it off and made a writing list for a while.
Sure.
And I just really, really can't encourage people enough to customize this. But, you know, best practice is they are the next visible, physical next action in each one of these lists, so that when you're going to do work, you don't have to rethink anything. You can just look at your list of options, and then you can decide what you want to do. The other takeaway that I had from you, David, is I remember at our staff meeting, we were all talking, and people were saying, well, when I look at my list, what's the time frame? And, you know, should it be a week? Should it be a month? Should it be 3 months? And you said something that really, really something I drive home with clients, which is when I'm going to do work, these are the list of options I want to see. These are the list of calls I want to see. These are the list of things errands I want to see. And I've always used that. And if I don't want to see that as an option, I either delete it, incubate it, or delegate it. That's been very, very helpful.
Yeah. And, you know, another example of what we're talking about, just to show you the range, I was coaching a very senior guy on Wall Street, very, very slick tech guy. He you know, was thinking actually back then it was to his palm from Outlook. And he had a protocol set up with his assistant so that he had his calls divided into client calls, internal calls, and personal calls. And he had and then his assistant actually sorted those for him. So all he had to do was come in and sync his palm and then run out. And in the limo, he could then deal with the client calls first, and then, you know, and it sort of in that order. So it made sense to him. You know, I push back on everybody whenever they want to do that, because we watch people really kind of dig themselves into a big hole by trying to get it all perfect, you know, in terms of those distinctions. But it made absolutely perfect sense to him, and it made it a lot easier to deal with what they were dealing with.
David, Barbara has a question. Do either Meg or you have an at-today list where they pull things from all the other contexts to work on that day?
Yes. As you know, eProductivity, actually, the software that we use with Lotus Notes, gives you the option to do that. So there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're willing to, and Eric built into the software, a clear button where if the world gets crazy, as it often does, you can just go clear all of that and then do another one. What you don't want to do is put that too much in concrete. But I've met several people that are really, really, you know, pristine GTDers that keep their list very clean, and the night before or that morning, they just look through it all and get a 3x5 card and jot themselves notes of the 3 or 4 things they want to do if they get any windows at all that day to be able to do them. I think that works great. I don't think there's nothing wrong with that at all. You just don't want to put it in concrete and then wrap yourself, you know, tie yourself up in your own knickers, you know, because then the world changes on you. So
exactly, because that's the thing that I just say to clients is like, look, just make sure that you're not doing this. If I get no interruptions today, I can do this, this, and 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 this. You know, you're going to have interruptions. So it is a punch list to be able to, like you said, not be attached to it, because if you don't get it done, because you have to evaluate it against the work as it appears. then I've
Yep.
seen it work really beautifully for people. Because I think a lot of people think getting things done doesn't adhere to or think that it's the best practice for it. So I've seen it work, and I've seen it also not work.
Yep.
Anything else, David, or can we move on to the weekly review?
Move on to the weekly review.
Move on. That wonderful weekly review, that critical success factor.
Yeah, well, this maybe it's self-evident if people just can see this on the screen. You know, adapting the 11 steps. You know, maybe you don't have to do them all. It really is a holistic model. So as long as you orient yourself appropriately and get sort of feel like I've pulled up the rear guard, I'm kind of ready to tackle the next 7 days, and I don't have to, when I get out there and start moving so fast and I don't have time to think, I need to just trust I've already thought. So you sort of hardwire your intuitive intelligence. So you can kind of come at it from any different angle that you want. I wouldn't get too tied in your knickers about that one either. But you do, you know, there are some critical components. You need to, you know, make sure you've reviewed your calendar, what's coming towards you. A lot of my review is calendar review because a lot of my work is so tied to my travel and delivery and things that I do that way. And so that generates a lot of my projects and a lot of my actions simply by going pretty discreetly through everything, you know, the last couple of weeks on my calendar and looking as far out as I actually have stuff on my calendar. So that's a lot of what my weekly review entails, as well as cleaning up my action list. But to a large degree, that's the biggest piece of mine.
Yeah, and you didn't name it. You didn't number it 1, 2, 3, 4 through 11. You know, that's one of the things I point out to folks is that these are just some recommendations of what do you need to be having your eyes on weekly. And you know, I do think that there's a little rhyme or reason of how you divided it into the get clear, get current, and get creative section.
Sure.
One of the things that for some people, and even I still need to do this, I separate out the get clear from the get current part. You know, sometimes I can sit in one sitting and do both of them, but for some reason I really like to collect, process, and organize and do a mind sweep, even though I'm doing that every day. But if I've got some stragglers, I like to do that. And then the next day I really kind of come in that get current part. For me, it's kind of two kinds of thinking, and I can do it both ways, but that's kind of a tip for people on the weekly review.
Yeah.
The other is this day. Go ahead.
By the way, you know, our friend Jim Whitten, the executive of the Hunger Project, you know, Jim has the last time I talked to him anyway, he has a Thursday night, he gets clear. He cleans up that's when he zeroes out his email and cleans everything up. And then first thing Friday morning is when he does a real weekly review where he doesn't have to worry about the backlog. You know, he can really start with a fresh kind of way to think about the weekly review at a higher horizon. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then day of week, you know, again, I always just say, look, it's best practice. I mean, I just have that, you know, that wonderful scuzz factor, which is I can't really go that long without doing it. And I used to in the beginning schedule it, and I don't really have to schedule it anymore. I just know when I need to do it, unless, you know, things are really jamming with my calendar and I need to block out that time. You know, I just intuitively at this point know when I need to unhook, and sometimes I unhook for an hour, hour and a half, and sometimes I take a couple of hours to do a weekly review. It's like whatever time I need to spend reflecting to get back into that master and control place. You know, I know that I need to be able to carve out that time because I'll feel a whole lot better at the end of it. I've never not done a weekly review and said, wow, that was a waste of time.
Yeah. I like doing the weekly review when I have a good web connection over the years. You know, there are so many things that I can whip off with 2-minute actions as I'm getting ahas, or I want to see if that's something before I can decide what my action is on something to get current. So I like to do that. So I will tend to wait until I have a good web connection. It's not critical, but it's useful for me.
And in terms of location, actually, Kelly did a wonderful interview with 2 of our GTD Connect members, Dana and Barb, on location. And they did a wonderful sharing of how they do and where they do their weekly review. Any pieces on that, David? And then we'll wrap up.
No, you know, I've heard lots of creative things. You know, people going to, you know, take their kid to choir practice and they sit in the back of the church and doing their weekly. Was that Mike? I think somebody did that. I think that's great. It's a great idea. I mean, plane trips are really good, especially if you're wired, and a lot more planes are wired these days. So, you know, I did a weekly review flying back from Chicago yesterday. So it kind of whenever and wherever. And, you know, again, a lot of people listening to this are doing weekly reviews. So, you know, you can all giggle, tee hee ha ha. So any day of the week, any location is fine if you can do it. But of course, it helps to start to build some sort of habit so that when you, that time, that day, that you sit down in that place, you know, you sort of move into that context. Starbucks, you know, a lot of weekly reviews get done at Starbucks. So.
Yeah, my last tip on this weekly review is I think, you know, I see this more than not. You guys, you know, when you schedule that 3 or 4 hours in your weekly review, or even 2 hours, I think people just go numb to it. So for any of those Connect members that aren't doing it weekly, just start with an hour. I mean, that's really pretty hard to blow off if you just schedule that hour, and at least start to get back into the game of doing them weekly. So thank you so much for participating today, you GTD Connect members. What fabulous champions you are of the Getting Things Done methodology. And if you have further questions, please contact us at webinars@davidcode.com. Anything you want to just wrap up with, David?
Yeah, just thanks. I was delighted. I had the question box open on one of my screens so I could see what you guys are writing, and great stuff, and delighted to have you in the camp and on the team, and it gives us juice too. So appreciate your playing. Thanks, Meg.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day.